And now we will, both you and Dr. Michaels, and now we'll hear from Dr. Laura Schmidt, who is at the University of California at San Francisco. And welcome, and we're looking forward to hear your comments.
Thanks so much. I'm going to talk today about industry funding bias in the case of nutrition science, and particularly make the argument that ultra-processed foods are the most important part of the food system that we should be thinking about in terms of regulating and addressing funding bias. I got my start in research in the late 80s in an alcohol research center while I was a grad student at Berkeley. And when I applied for the job and got it, they asked me to sign a statement that I would not ever accept funding from the alcohol beverage industry. And I sort of carried that forward in my career, and never, I solely funded by NIH private foundations in my university. And but as I've gravitated into the nutrition science field, I've been quite surprised at how common it is to accept industry funding. And so I want to talk about nutrition science as sort of a special case of really institutionalized funding bias. So I'm going to start by talking about sponsor influence and in studies in ultra-processed food, look at meta-research, and then talk a little bit about the historical and ideological roots of sponsor influence from my perspective. So why focus on ultra-processed foods, and what are they? The NOVA classification by Carlos Monteiro in Brazil has really taken off as a sort of way of understanding the sprawling food system and nutritional issues, everything from broccoli to soda. And increasingly, regulators and people concerned about the obesity pandemic and cardiometabolic disease are focusing on this category of ultra-processed foods, and thinking about this class of foods as special and unique from a health standpoint. The definition of an ultra-processed food is it's industrially produced. It combines refined sugar, fat, and salt. And that's sort of the fundamental way the food industry generates these foods. But alongside, there are chemical additives, emulsifiers, colors and flavors that are increasingly being looked at as in their disease-causing in and of themselves. This classification system has really become an engine for policy change. There's a movement internationally to regulate using front of package warning labels, regulate ultra-processed foods, and these are countries throughout the Latin American region that are doing that. And there are also efforts to tax ultra-processed foods, and particularly soda and sugar-sweetened beverages. So the industry sponsors of ultra-processed food are very large transnational corporations that roll up all of these various brands under them. It's a pretty concentrated industry and drives a lot of research. So my argument for why we should really be thinking about ultra-processed foods when we're thinking about conflicts of interest in research is, first of all, this is the way I like to think about it, as these are the alcohol or the tobacco of the food system. Yes, there's a lot of conflicted science around, is broccoli good for you? Are nuts good for you? But ultra-processed foods have this footprint of public health harm, and that raises the stakes in getting the story right scientifically about how they're affecting health. They're abundant in the food supply. So in the US, about 60% of calories consumed by people are ultra-processed foods. Lots of observational studies, the time horizon for tracking chronic disease outcomes from poor diet is very lengthy, and so we've got a lot of observational studies. They do point to ultra-processed foods as a high-risk set of part of our food supply. Interestingly, there are now some clinical trials that are showing that a diet exclusively in ultra-processed foods actually increases the number of calories that people are consuming. Kevin Hall at NIDDK conducted a really fascinating controlled feeding trial and showed that if you feed people the same diet, but in ultra-processed foods, they consume 500 calories more per day. So that's like eating a Big Mac. The other thing is there's increasing research. Tara Fazzino is looking at the relationship between ultra-processed foods and hyperpalatable foods, or foods we know from documents research that food corporations are industrially engineering foods to trigger the reward drive in the human brain. And so Dr. Fazzino's research is really demonstrating that there's a big overlap between foods that are hyperpalatable and designed to make people eat more and not get satiated, and ultra-processed foods. So for all of these reasons, I really want to make the case that ultra-processed foods are what we should be worried about. If you look at the meta studies on funding bias, specifically in terms of ultra-processed foods, and what's interesting is most of the meta studies we've got are about ultra-processed foods. There's some on dairy and other parts of the food system, but here are a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and the effect sizes that some of these studies are showing for funding bias: 32.7 times more likely to find an increased risk of no increased risk of diabetes due to sugar sweetened beverage consumption, 57 times more likely. So the industry funding bias in this particular area of nutrition science is quite stunning and important for us to really look at. And these are repeated meta-analyses and systematic reviews. There's a very interesting and well-documented case. Some of the people in this room, Gary Ruskin in particular, have done some fascinating research on the Coca-Cola-funded Global Energy Balance Network that was in operation between around maybe 2008 to the mid-2000, 2015 was when this whole thing erupted in a scandal with multiple New York Times articles around this network and lots of FOIA documents involving the scientists involved. But essentially what these Coca-Cola funded scientists were doing was to make the case that physical inactivity is the cause of the obesity pandemic, not food, not diet. We have a lot of good evidence to show that physical activity matters for maintenance of weight loss, but not actual weight gain. But this network was making a very strong case that physical activity is the issue. They had studies going all around the world on childhood obesity in many low and middle income countries, as well as in the United States. A very interesting systematic review found that the global energy balance, between 2008 and 2016, there were about 389 Coca-Cola sponsored studies in 169 scientific journals. And most of them were making the case that the obesity crisis is due to physical inactivity. Eventually, when the network was exposed in the New York Times, Coca-Cola set about to do a transparency initiative where they put on their website all of the studies that they were funding. This secondary analysis of that found that actually only about 5% were being reported, but it's wonderful that Coca-Cola took that step. Um, so thinking more sociologically about why is it that nutrition science and ultra-processed food research may be a special case when it comes to conflicts of interest. Historically, most nutrition research is industry funded. Now, Dariush Mozaffarian at Duke tried to come up with some kind of calculation. This is a tough thing to nail down, but he, noted in the BMJ about 1.5 billion in U.S. federal spending in 2009 in nutrition science versus 60 billion of industry funding. So the majority of our nutrition science is in fact funded by the food industry. Why is this the case? Historically, you have this very synergistic relationship between academics who are doing nutrition and agricultural research and the food and beverage industry. And this goes all the way back to the land-grant universities. And to this day, there's a very tight relationship between academics in this space and industry funders, particularly in agricultural research. There's also quite a bit of fragmentation when you think about who's responsible for food nutrition research. And yesterday, there was a really compelling case being made around it needs to come from the top. We need organized leadership around the scientific conflicts of interest. The challenge with nutrition science is that a lot of it's going on in the USDA, again, where agricultural and food industry interests are really kind of embedded in the way things are done. You see the same thing internationally. I've gone to meetings where the Food and Agricultural Organization folks are there, and they're really speaking from an industry perspective, as opposed to WHO, which is trying to do more research and promote work in nutrition science. There's no National Institute on Nutrition, so funding in this space is a lot tighter than in other areas of medical research. And finally, there are a lot of industries, not just the food and beverage industry, that have a stake in what we learn about ultra-processed foods and nutrition science because of the interface with the agricultural and agrochemical, fossil fuel pharmaceutical, but even the tobacco industry. And a lot of people ask, well, what the tobacco industry and food? And we've done quite a bit of research on this issue. And these are all brands that have in the past or are owned and developed by tobacco companies that owned food subsidiaries in the mid-'80s or mid-2000s. Philip Morris owned the largest food corporation in the world, Kraft General Foods. And so there are a lot of stakeholders in the industry side that care about nutrition science. Another root of the issues in this space has to do with the scientific paradigm, the actual ideology and understanding of what we're doing in nutrition science. Wonderful book on this concept of nutritionism as the dominant paradigm in nutrition science, which is the idea that scientists should focus on the health, harms, or benefits of a single food or a single nutrient. And a lot of this comes out of the history of where did nutrition science come from. Was about vitamin deficiencies and global undernutrition. But over time, as we've moved out of undernutrition and moved into parts of the globe that are becoming more and more affected by obesity and cardiometabolic disease, we really need to shift this paradigm. Vitamin deficiencies are less of an issue these days than some of the other issues related to overnutrition. There are a lot of problems with this paradigm. We know now, if you're worried about the things that kill people today, obesity and cardiometabolic disease, whole diets are what matter. much more calories and overall diet, the composition of the diet, rather than single nutrients. And what we seem to be stuck in is this sort of food fad issue where nutrition science and public health says, oh, fat's bad for you, so the industry will take the fat out and put sugar or salt into the food. And so we have this sort of revolving door problem of demonizing one ingredient versus another. And of course, this is very confusing for the public, and as others have noted, undermines the credibility of nutrition science greatly. Importantly, the single nutrient idea and nutritionism are a critical tool for the food industry. And in fact, Marion Nestle calls this a food industry marketing strategy. And I think that this is one reason, given the dominance of food industry interest in nutrition science, I think this is one of the reasons that we seem to be stuck in nutritionism. Marion has this wonderful website, and on a weekly basis, she puts up the industry-funded study of the week. Now, the latest one is on meat. And here are the latest publications. Here's a study on beef consumption showing that it improves cognitive outcomes in children. And of course, this is funded by the Idaho Beef Council. And so there's a real concern around these single nutrient studies that are used as an industry marketing strategy to either tout the health benefits of their products or make the case that they're not harmful. Dr. Barrow showed this diagram yesterday, the cycle of bias. And I think one of the issues with nutrition science on ultra-processed foods is that the industry is very far upstream in terms of setting the research agenda and the narrative for nutrition science, whether it's focusing on single ingredients, but also just driving the research agenda in this field. And one of the reasons it can do this is because most of our US-based, I'm just focusing on the US here, professional societies and journals are sponsored by food companies. And you can see these are the three top main societies for dietitians and nutrition scientists and nutritionists. And they have these field journals. And and these are selected from the websites currently. These are current funders of these organizations. And many of them are some of them are in the pharmaceutical industry, but a lot of them are ultra-processed food corporations. Finally, this is a good example. In Oxford Academic Journal, Nutrition Reviews, it's funded and sponsored by the International Life Sciences Institute, which is a very well-researched front group for food and beverage industry interests. So here's the case where the entire journal is being driven by an industry front group. So in terms of recommendations for addressing some of these issues, here are a few thoughts. Obviously, and there's a lot of energy behind trying to come up with strategies to better fund independent science on ultra-processed foods. And because we have such a radically imbalanced funding arena, there needs to be some recalibration there. Obviously, trying to push back against this nutritionism framework, which really works as a marketing strategy for the food industry, trying to focus on whole diets, on the factors that drive obesity and cardiometabolic disease, as well as level of processing, and the NOVA classification is an example. This is a very important thing to try to rectify some of the challenges in this space. I've made the argument that we should really be scrutinizing that their products aren't harmful. So again, this is sort of going back to Dr. Michael's argument around where should the presumption of innocence lie? Earmarking the proceeds of soda taxes and fat taxes for independent research on ultra-processed foods, very much like what we do with tobacco, makes a ton of sense. If you think about the obesity and related disease crisis as an externality related to the harms of this that the industry is making, it makes a lot of sense. And we've got over 40 countries now taxing some kind of ultra-processed foods. And then finally, one of the things that I've felt for years is an issue is the need for one place where people in the general public or in the editorial world or journalists can go to understand who they're talking to. And again, this goes back to the need for national leadership. And so something like clinicaltrials.gov, where say you want to publish a paper, the editor says you got to go and fill out a form to explain who funds your research, very much like the people are doing in this meeting, just declare who funds your research. I feel the need for this because I've talked to more journalists who they'll say, well, so-and-so told me this, and you're telling me the total opposite. What's going on here? And I say, well, do you know who you're talking to? You're talking to somebody who is well known as an investigator that works for the food industry and often comes to conclusions that are friendly for the industry. And it'd be wonderful to have a place to go to send people where they can understand who they're talking to. I'll leave it at that. And thank you for your attention.